But I just wanted to get your sort of thumbnail journey through this thing called the web as a starting point.
Sure. I encountered the web first in the newsroom at the San Francisco Examiner in, God, I guess it was 1994, and it was 2 weeks before a strike was about to take place. And I kind of got excited about the web. I FTP'd a document about how to use HTML, and it was all very, kind of tickled all the right nerves in me. And then suddenly we were on strike, and there was this call on the part of the newspaper guild to put out a strike paper on the web. And what that meant was basically that the staff of the Examiner and the Chronicle, it was both papers on strike, would continue to serve the community by putting their news out online, which was a novel concept at the time. The assumption was that the web was all about static documents, repositories of papers and things like that, which was, plenty cool in itself. But this idea of breaking news stories, updating it every day, once a day, this was astonishing. So I did that, and that was it for me. That was pretty much my, infatuation experience with web publishing, and from that point on, it was pretty much over for me. I kind of felt that this was what I had to do, and within a year, I had left the Examiner, and a bunch of us together started Salon.com, and that was sort of, something that I figured might last a year or two. I was excited about it anyway, and it turned out to, it's actually, it outlasted the Examiner, which is
that's interesting.
Kind of amazing. To say that there even was a conception is probably putting far too much gloss on it. It was really an opportunistic attempt to see what we could do. Just, hey, bunch of journalists. David Talbot, who raised the money, was really originally interested in doing a print magazine, but it's always hard to raise money for print magazines that are not targeting a niche, and this was a very general interest kind of idea of, it's very hard to say what the focus was other than let's write stuff that we think is really good for people who we think are intelligent and see how it goes.
Yeah.
And doing that on the web meant there was an opportunity because nobody knew what the medium was about at the time. So whereas somebody could look at numbers for a print magazine and say, well, you can't do that, it won't work. They couldn't say that on the web. And in fact, there were people interested and willing to fund experiments on the web because it was all new. At the time, it was sort of a strange moment because I had felt that blogging was this really mature thing. It had been around almost a decade at that point, and I had been involved in it in various ways for quite a number of years. And it just seemed like, good time to do a book. And I found that a lot of people's reactions were along the lines of, well, how can you possibly write a history of this thing? It's just so new. What is, it's like you're writing a history of something that was just born yesterday. What's the point?
Right.
And then, but meanwhile, within the technology industry itself, there was just beginning this feeling that came to full flower by the time the book actually was published, that blogging was already yesterday's thing, that it was old hat, So I started in 2007, the book came out in 2009, and of course in those 2 years, Twitter came out of nowhere to become this huge phenomenon. Facebook was already around in 2007, but by 2009 it was sort of this world-dominating social network. And so there was this sort of feeling in Silicon Valley and in the technology industry that blogging was no longer, a hot thing. And so their attitude was kind of like, who wants to read about that? That's old hat. And the mainstream people were sort of like, it's too new to have a history. So it was a peculiar moment that was probably the worst possible time to try to write this book, except that it was the time that the story was fresh and
Sure.
that I had a chance to do it, and there it is. One of the things I heard a lot from people was, well, if you're writing about blogging, why is it a book? You should do a blog. And to me, that was such a strange thing to say. The point of a book is the opportunity, if you can, and if you have the right tools and the right material, to weave a story that has some coherence and some kind of arc and holds people's attention over a longer span. And blogs are great for entirely other reasons. And I couldn't see what this book would be in the form of a blog, but it seemed like a question that pretty much everyone who interviewed me about the book felt they had to ask.
But one other one that I have is related to the course that I've invented here, which is called Blogging a Better Planet, which essentially implies a certain optimism about the prospects for the web doing more good things than bad things. Although every day anyone who's on the web sees examples of how it can work counterproductively, where people can cocoon, people go out to the blogs that are like them and not really actually using the web to explore other points of view, or looking mostly at information within their own countries and not using the marvels of having a global network. And I don't know whether you see, in having scanned this and the trajectories over time, if you have your own sense of whether this will basically just amplify our existing traits in how we deal with information, or could it actually improve prospects that will get things right as a species? So, that we can build, that it can be a tool for building a better planet.
Yeah. So there's this whole arc of kind of critical perspective on this issue that starts with Cass Sunstein, who wrote a book about this stuff almost a decade ago now, and then carried forward most recently by Eli Parazer's book, what is it called? It just came out, The Filter Bubble,
right,
is the title. And it's all these arguments basically are variations of this sort of echo chamber concept, this idea that the web encourages the Latin, or I guess Greek term is homophily, that we stick to people who are like us, that we flock together with birds of a feather, or whatever that cliche is, and that therefore, and the web and all the technologies that are built on the web just sort of enable that and let us block out things we don't want to know. And the assumption there is that the old regime of journalism, with a small number of gatekeepers, the network news or the front pages, did a good job of somehow mixing it up and presenting us with lots of different perspectives. And I think if you buy that, then you look at the web and say, gee, it's a step down in some way. But if you view it as, I grew up with network television, and I didn't feel that I was getting bombarded with interesting, conflicting perspectives. I felt I was getting this narrow, middle-of-the-road sliver of what I knew was a far more variegated and diverse world. So, it's not. There's an element of nostalgia in all of this that I always want to be on guard against and urge other people to do the same. My personal experience is that the web makes it much easier, if you have any inclination at all, to sample and explore the perspectives of people you disagree with. Now, doing so can be really exhausting, it can be maddening, it can be frustrating, and it's not something that I recommend doing in, kind of like marathons, because you will get really unhappy. But you have the chance to do it in a way that I don't think before you could go to a library, and if you were a liberal, you could go to the library or the newsstand and pick up the National Review and kind of sample a conservative point of view, but you didn't really have a sense of what the conversation was among people you disagreed with. Today you have a chance to actually kind of eavesdrop on the public conversations of people who have a perspective that's entirely different from yours. You can actually begin to get a sense of what assumptions are driving their thinking and their discussions, and really understand their psychology better, and whether that leaves you feeling a little bit more, sympathetic or empathetic to them, or whether you're more afraid as a result. I mean, it varies. But that alone makes me optimistic. I don't think that any of us have a clear picture yet. I certainly haven't seen any studies that are persuasive in any way that that tell us which direction this is going. I looked at a few of the studies in Say Everything that attempted to use network science to claim that people on the left only read left-wing blogs and people on the right only read right-wing blogs. And the question there is, so there's only a very small percentage of people, if you're typically you're going to be reading mostly stuff you agree with and a little bit of stuff you disagree with. And the question I ask, which I don't think any of these studies answers, is, well, is that an increase from what was possible and what was happening before the web, or a decrease? Right. My hunch is it's an increase, but we don't have any real useful data to know whether I'm right about that.
You were talking about, the echo chamber and the kind of a loss of a national narrative. That together with the fact that blogging is by nature a lot less filtered and to that extent perhaps more biased. Certainly I think even journalists probably take more liberties in their language when writing a blog versus writing, an article for a newspaper. Do you see that as, again, more confirmation, more bias confirmation, and perhaps more polarization? That blogging might be contributing to this very polarized environment that we have.
I think,
polarized and to a great degree intolerant, because not only do we go to the blogs we want to follow and the people that think like us, but the language and the approach in blogging is not that more diplomatic, and politically correct approach of trained journalists.
Yeah. Well, there's no question that there are blogs that are, inflammatory and that spread lies and that are making the world a worse place. There's absolutely no question about that. To me, there's sort of again though an assumption in the question that we have this definition of journalists who are unbiased or who strive for less bias, and then we have bloggers who are less who just don't have the same set of values or practices. And when I look at the media landscape, I think, well, what are the sort of epicenters of bias? Where does the most misinformation kind of cluster and spread? Sorry?
Cable news networks?
You're right. The cable networks are really kind of it. And weirdly, they are also kind of, we group them under this rubric of professional journalists because they're paid and they work for these networks that are doing news, and so they are they've got this umbrella over them, this professional kind of label, and so I think it's more useful to think in terms not of the form being the key thing here, the form of a blog, the form of a cable network, the form of a newspaper for that matter, but really what's the intent of the person doing the work. And so I've been talking a lot in the past couple of years about journalism as being not to think of journalists as a role, but to think of journalism as an activity that anyone can do. And you're doing journalism when you're actually trying to present what you believe is, to the best of your ability, an accurate account of an event in a fair way. And I use words like accurate and fair rather than objective or unbiased, because I actually think they have a simpler and more kind of down-to-earth understanding that people have. You have a kind of gut sense of when you're treating someone else fairly, I think, and that is, to me, a more achievable standard for journalism than objectivity, which has always, to me, been a baffling concept.
Hi, my question is about the phasing out of technology, or rather like stations or outlets for, say, like cable, even telephones and stuff like that. Do you think that the internet as well as blogging is gonna kind of outdate those things? And do you think that without that outdate, that the internet is now going to become privatized and there's going to be less of an opportunity for people to use it freely because of the fact that, a lot of these things are privatized, and that's why we don't trust them. That's why they're not objective, and we find that there is that bias. If the internet becomes that one mecca of information and that one mecca of just utility as far as communication goes, do you think that that'll be an issue?
So, I mean, I think we're really lucky, and it's kind of an amazing thing that the internet even managed to sort of emerge as this open network that we're using right now. It wasn't inevitable. One of the things I started talking about this moment in 1994 when I got excited about the web, and one of the things that really made the difference was that it was this sort of public space. It was this thing that was not controlled by any one corporation the way, at the time there was like America Online and CompuServe. They weren't attached to the internet. They were these private networks, and the assumption was that was how we were going to end up communicating online. And instead, the internet became the model, and we've had that for 15 years now as the dominant way of communicating digitally. So the problem is that the fight over this stuff is now happening in the United States. It's happening in a really sort of wonky, complex, hard to understand realm of regulators, and the debate over net neutrality, it's called here in the U.S. In other countries, it has to do with all of these sort of UN regulations, and there's kind of this huge and very legal and this fight over this stuff that makes most people's eyes glaze over. And sadly, those are the kinds of battles where corporate money tends to win, because the lobbyists are spending all the time figuring out what serves their interests, and the public's interest isn't always as well served. So there's always this kind of battle to keep the internet open. Facebook, to me, is a danger to the extent that Facebook is sort of sitting there saying, we are actually going to replace the internet. You're going to do everything you want to do through Facebook. It's a wonderful service in all kinds of ways, and that's why, millions of people are using it. But I'm wary of it because I'm much happier with the idea of an open network that all kinds of people, organizations, and companies can use. So I think that there's a lot of resilience in that too. I'm fairly optimistic about the internet's survival, because I think there's a lot of very passionate people out there defending it. But it's always sort of a fight, and I think it'll continue to be.
You mentioned Facebook. How do you feel about Google? Because Google is also one of those mega...
Yeah.
We're all becoming Googleized.
Google is a huge power and a potential danger to the internet as well. The reason I'm a little personally less worried about Google is that I think that Google's whole success was really built on top of the open internet. The people who founded Google kind of have, I think, in their bones a belief in the importance of the open network that allowed them to succeed and become fabulously wealthy. And I think that they actually are committed in a different way from a lot of other companies to the ideal of openness. Now, that doesn't mean that they won't do things that are wrong, or that are anti-open if it serves their corporate interests or serves their shareholders. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't hold them to just as rigorous a standard about privacy and about other issues as we do Facebook or any other company. My kind of just gut sense as an observer of these companies and as a former technology journalist who's written about this stuff for a long time is that Google is less of a threat than Facebook.
Yeah, what would you say are like the first three beware things before you do the diving in?
Always be generous in your linking, to the extent that if you saw something on another site, first, link to them. Give them credit. You'll want them to do the same with you someday. And also, it's a great way of winning authority with your readers. If you say that you're writing about a study or a news report and you link to it, what you're saying to the reader is, you can go take a look and see if I'm representing it fairly or not. Right. It's this basic level of accountability. And sadly, in a lot of mainstream journalism, it took a really long time to sort of get the websites to understand this, because there was this perceived commercial interest in keeping people on your site, not sending them away. And so a lot of reporters were discouraged from linking off-site. I think that's largely, though not completely, gone away. But in a blog, it's just the right thing to do.
So one thing, we're going to be visiting Huffington Post in about 2 weeks, going on a field trip, because a couple of my friends, as you know, a number of people from the New York Times have moved there. So, and what would you recommend that students ask or be thinking about when they go to Huffington?
Well, Huffington is just this amazing story that, it started as this sort of group of bloggers that Ariana invited in, and it has morphed over in several years into this large news organization that's now, a part of AOL, and that's hiring lots and lots of people. And I'm really curious, what I would ask them, what I'd love to hear them talk about is how they see the relationship between all of these people from places like the New York Times that are now, in their ranks, who are essentially doing, a version of what they've always done in a slightly different format, with this kind of constellation of bloggers that have been there all along, who really do think of themselves as bloggers rather than as journalists. And how do these two things relate, or do they not relate? Is Huffington Post simply sort of, was blogging just a step along the way for this institution that now intends and indeed seems to be becoming a much more traditional mainstream newsroom, which is certainly kind of the way it looks from the outside. Yeah. Where does Huffington Post kind of retain its blogginess?
Good questions. If you could write a new chapter to the book, or like the opening of your if you were to do a next book, in other words, what's what's happened since 2009 that you see as the kind of bullet point you would highlight?
The funny thing is, I actually wrote that. There's this kind of epilogue that I wrote to the paperback release of the book, which the publisher, for various logistical reasons, couldn't include in the book, but it's up on the book's website.
Oh, I didn't.
And it's
okay.
It's really an
Homework.
essay about, largely as you would expect, about social networking, Twitter, Facebook, and I think I called it something like, and it's a while ago, so I'm probably not remembering this right, but it's called something like 4 arguments for the persistence of blogging and why. Because certainly in the time since the book came out, there has been, kind of one report after another that blogging is dead and, we should all just move on. And I think that's kind of absurd, but you do hear this periodically. And there are a bunch of different reasons that people offer for why blogging is dead, and I kind of refute them one by one. And I think ultimately, each time there's this new form that comes along online, there's this period when people are so excited about it that they think it's going to be universal. It's going to eat up everything. And so, email was basically going to be the only thing we would need, and we would do everything through email. Websites, static websites, well, all you need is a home page, and that's it. And then, bulletin boards, and then, one thing after another. And when blogs came along, it was like, oh, blogs are it. That is the only thing that matters. And now we're seeing the same thing happen with social networks. And if you look at the history of all these things, they never disappear. They never die. What happens is that each time another one comes along and displaces the last hot thing, that thing actually has a chance to emerge, to find what's unique about it and what its place is in the ecosystem. And so with blogs, I think what we can already see is that this is the form you choose when you have something to say or something you want to report on. It's something that you're going to do over time, because blogs support that, and it's something that you're going to put some energy into, because a blog is not as simple as 140 characters, and it doesn't give you necessarily the immediate kind of feedback, the immediate gratification that sharing on Facebook does from your friends. It's a little bit lonelier, although it's still very much a social thing. If and as you get some people to pay attention to what you're doing. And blogging is writing in a way that I think, Twitter can be a creative outlet. We've all seen that, and we know about things like, the Mayor Emanuel, which I loved, but for the most part, it's a utilitarian thing. It's like, a way to speak to a large group of people really quickly and to share a nugget of information with them. And blogs, sort of hilariously, given how much criticism they evoked in their early days as being the death of writing, are actually just another form for writers to use. And I think that's what we're seeing today, and I don't think that will vanish anytime soon.
Great. Well, this has been really fabulous. Thank you very much.